We're all keenly aware of the growing intrusion of religious groups to try and exert their beliefs and values into the public arena. Our country was founded on the principles of the separation of church and state. We all know this. And we have these organizations who are represented here, among some others, to thank for their tireless efforts to continue fighting to protect our basic human rights. I would like to, at this point, turn it over to Steph Campbell to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Dave. It is such a great privilege to me to be able to introduce Rachel Lazar. She is the president and CEO at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a graduate of Harvard University and the University of Chicago Law School, and also a former national board member of NARAL Pro-Choice America. Rachel is a lawyer, advocate, and strategist. She's dedicated her career to making our country more inclusive. She's a proven track record of uniting both faith and secular leaders and advocacy organizations to make really tangible progress on some of the most important issues of our time. An advocate for racial justice, she's led workshops, given speeches, worked with schools and universities to challenge racism and expose privilege. She's worked to further the historic mission of separating religion and government, which she does so remarkably well from leading Americans United for Separation of Church and State. So, Rachel, I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Steph. And it's so great to be with everyone today. Amy Madonna is a mom of 3 in South Carolina who wants to help kids in need at her local foster care agency. And her own taxpayer dollars fund that very agency. But she isn't allowed to help because she's Catholic and not evangelical Protestant. Greg Tucker is the director of student life at a Christian school, a non-denominational Christian school in Colorado. He put on an assembly to address the pervasive racism he witnessed at his school, and then he was fired after parents complained. The school claims that Greg is a minister and that they have a religious freedom right to fire him under the First Amendment. In the Bremerton School District in Washington State, Coach Kennedy's football team players are subjected to his public prayers at the 50-yard line after each game. Coach Kennedy claims he has a religious freedom right to do this, but the lower courts haven't agreed. And that's because the law has so long understood that the pressure of praying or playing isn't allowed from a coach of a public school. But now the Supreme Court is expected to accept the case, and that's not a good thing. Charlie Craig and David Mullins just wanted to celebrate their wedding with a beautiful cake, but the bakery they chose, Masterpiece Cake Shop, turned them away and was found to have a religious freedom right, a religious exemption to do so, to circumvent the state's anti-discrimination laws. So I was asked to begin by explaining why church-state separation is so important. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I hope that these stories convey that without church-state separation, none of us, right, not just the non-religious, none of us is truly free to believe as we choose and to live as ourselves. At its core, the separation of church and state is about equality and not just freedom. It ensures that all people, whether they practice a specific religion or not, are treated the same regardless of their beliefs. And it enables us to live as our true selves and not be subjected to the religious codes of others. As you know, our country was the first nation to be founded on church-state separation, and it's the bedrock of religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson talked about protecting the Jew and the Gentile, the Mohammedan and the Hindu and the infidel of every faith. Keeping government completely out of religion safeguards every American's right to practice or not practice according to their beliefs. And when we succeed at shielding our secular laws from any religious influence, it frees us to come together as equals and to build a stronger democracy. As Steph was just saying, church-state separation underpins so many key issues. And let me just pause here to say that at Americans United, we think that Steph is a model activist and a model board member, bringing her full, smart, and committed self to everything she does. And I'm quite positive you all have witnessed that. Our org and our cause staff are so lucky to have you. So let's start with the sort of top of mind church-state issue du jour, COVID. The law shouldn't allow anyone to use their religious beliefs to harm others. And the 2,000 person poll that Americans United conducted in the first part of this year, and it was weighted to represent the full American population, told us that 79% of Americans agree with that statement. Religious freedom is not the right to risk other people's lives. And in cases where public health officials have found that religious exemptions are not in the best interest of public safety, they shouldn't be required. Religious freedom doesn't provide immunity from life-threatening diseases, and it doesn't provide immunity from laws that are meant to protect everyone equally. AU filed more than 50 friend of the court briefs trying to ensure that religious gatherings were treated the same as secular ones during the height of the pandemic. And we were winning until Amy Coney Barrett joined the court. Now we're beginning to fight mass religious exemptions from vaccine mandates, exemptions that exemplify, once again, why religion should never be a justification to cause harm to others. So that's where we draw the line at Americans United when people talk about religious freedom rights versus other rights, right? Where it would cause harm to others. So let's look at reproductive rights. For some, quite amazingly, especially sort of if you're coming from our community, it's not intuitive that abortion freedom, let me call it reproductive freedom more broadly, is a church-state separation issue. And in our poll, only a quarter of people right off the bat made the connection. We've had to fight up to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration's insistence that religious organizations did not have to provide birth control access, even indirectly, to their employees or students under the Affordable Care Act. Church-state separation is about whether your boss can turn around and limit your access to birth control, transition-related care, or even substance abuse treatment because it's not what their religious views dictate. And it's even worse on abortion. My entire lifetime, I've watched the religious right make this the wedge issue of wedge issues as they attempt to impose a narrow biblical interpretation on every female body in the country. And I do say a narrow one. I'm speaking now as a Reformed Jew, where, of course, everything is debated. But at least many rabbis say that Jews have an obligation to have an abortion where the woman's life is at risk. And the irony is, at least for evangelical Christians, that they changed their position and theology on this issue after they celebrated Roe versus Wade in 1973 as a religious freedom decision. It's part of their strategy of reinforcing white Christian power, and they joined hands with the Catholics back then. And now, in both Texas and Mississippi, the Supreme Court's going to have to decide if it's going to respect the precedent of Roe v. Wade and the autonomy and freedom of millions of Americans, or yield to a purely religious belief about when life begins. This dangerous agenda that's sort of oriented towards blocking people's access to birth control, abortion care, gender-affirming treatment, and other forms of healthcare are especially harming women, LGBTQ people, and people of color in our country. But the largest number of legal cases that we have in many of our fights on the ground are rooted in another battlefield for religious freedom, LGBTQ equality. To live and love as you wish, that's something that most Americans take for granted, but for LGBTQ people, it's never a given. and religious extremists and their lawmaker allies are working relentlessly to block the advancement of LGBTQ rights and roll back the recent gains that we've made. For decades, religious extremists have fought any expansion of LGBTQ rights, but the battle's really been amped up since the Supreme Court's Obergefell decision for marriage equality and the Bostock decision that confirmed that sexual orientation and gender identity are protected classes. Christian nationalists have made clear that they will go to court and state legislatures again and again to insist on religious exemptions for religious schools, universities, organizations, and individuals, as well as insist on what they call biblical truths about sex and gender. Last summer, the court's Fulton decision, which was found on really narrow grounds, held that Catholic charities in Philadelphia could have a religious exemption and not place foster care children in need of loving homes with LGBTQ families. But we're representing several other clients who will not stop until it's legally acknowledged that LGBTQ rights are human rights, and they are trying to adopt and foster kids, and they are seeking to have equal rights in civil rights in their workplaces. Racial justice and separation of church and state, these are more linked than you might realize. At America's founding, the promise of religious freedom wasn't extended to Black and Indigenous people. What's more, religion was sometimes used by the courts and public officials to justify slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic racism. And when the separation of church and state is breached, religion's interaction with systemic racism unduly harms people of color. White Christian nationalists are an increasing threat to religious freedom and racial equity, and I heard this from some of the activists that were introducing themselves before I spoke. Trump's now defunct travel ban targeted people from African nations and Muslim majority countries. And Black churches remain targeted by white Christian nationalists who continue to use religion as an instrument of white supremacy. Robbie Jones, a friend of mine who's the president of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, has pointed out in his in-depth research that white evangelicals are the least likely to acknowledge this country's history of racial discrimination and the structural racism that still endures. Church-state separation is about freedom without favor and equality without exception. And nowhere is this more true than how this country is treating the growing number of non-religious people. The government should treat all people equally, but when it comes to religious equality, we know that that's not always the case. I'm thinking about one of our members who told me as an atheist in the South that when his father appointed him the executor of his estate when he died, his siblings discredited him on the stand in court because he's an atheist. The non-religious are excluded every time the government sponsors or favors religious events, whether it's the Bladensburg Cross or in the form of invocations. And yet, emboldened white Christian nationalists are consistently promoting unfair laws and policies by falsely claiming that America is really a Christian nation. They're falsifying our history just to justify their agenda. And they're excluding everyone but themselves from real religious freedom, attempting to redefine religious freedom as religious privilege for some. The government can't force anyone to engage in religious activities. They shouldn't tax you to pay for the private religious education of others. That's a Supreme Court case this term, by the way, called Carson v. Macon. And events like the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington run counter to everything that's in the DNA of our secular nation. And at Americans United, we are working every day to hold this country accountable to its promise of being a place where we can all live as ourselves and believe as we choose. We bring together people of all religions and none, and we fight in the courts, in legislatures, and in the public square. So how can you join us? And I did put a link in earlier. Here's another one that I'll just add to the chat box. So that's one way that you can join us. But you can also be part of our movement by growing the religious freedom movement, by growing the church-state separation movement. Because I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that church-state separation as an issue doesn't tend to be top of mind or sort of first place, right? Even among many of our natural allies. So what can you do besides joining Americans United? You can spotlight the issue of church-state separation in every community that you're part of, right? In every affinity group that you're part of, right? When you join hands with others in every capacity that I just heard about earlier, you can remind them that the center of many of our rights and freedoms is church-state separation, and, right, because people believe in it, that's what our poll showed us, and that it's under threat today. That's sort of the keys to the castle on our issue. Because once people understand what the threat is, then they come alive and they join our movement. So if you agree with the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a personal role model, that, quote, your right to swing your arms ends just where the other person's, she said, man's nose begins. If you believe in what the late Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, that, quote, those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must answer a difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly? If you believe in everyone's right to live as ourselves and believe as we choose in reproductive freedom, in LGBTQ equality, in racial justice, then please consider joining Americans United today.
So Rachel, this is Steph again, and thank you for your kind words about me. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what AU is doing in terms of vouchers and explain to people why this is such a problem.
There was a case last term called Espinoza versus Montana, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the question was whether a state that allows taxpayer money, and it is taxpayer money, I'll talk about that in a minute, to fund private schools, private non-religious schools, has to allow that money also to go to private religious schools, right? And that's really what the voucher debate is first and foremost about, whether taxpayer dollars can fund private, and let me say, mostly religious schools. What the Supreme Court unfortunately found is that, yes, states have to give taxpayer dollars to private religious schools if they're giving them to private non-religious schools. There's an even more serious case this term, Carson v. Macon, that I referenced earlier. And in that case in Maine, there are public school districts where there aren't any, they're very rural, and there aren't any public schools. So the state is directly funding private schools, but wanting to make sure that that our taxpayer dollars for citizens in Maine weren't funding religion, the state barred those dollars in that program from funding private religious education. The question before this Supreme Court, and they have granted cert, so it's incredibly scary and awful, is whether public taxpayer dollars can be required to fund specifically religious education. The truth is that across our country, the vast majority of voucher programs fund religious education. And that's why, as a part of protecting religious freedom, we fight them, because we do not want to require any taxpayer to sacrifice their religious freedom by having to fund someone else's religion or religious education, right? We leave that to parents to do, right? And families to do with their own children. But there's also another reason. And that was exposed in a book by a guy called Steve Suits about vouchers and Brown versus Board of Education. And what he found through his research is that vouchers were really created as part of the Southern strategy to fight desegregation. And that all of the states that were promoting vouchers in their state legislatures were doing so because they wanted to fund private, white, Christian academies so that the white people that were opposed to desegregation could have state money to send their kids to all white Christian schools. So there's also a very sordid racial aspect to vouchers. At Americans United, we co-lead the National Coalition for Public Education and sit around a table with a huge number of public education groups who fight for public education. Why? Public education was actually in our founding document stuff. It's in the New York Times article about the beginning of Americans United. And by the way, we'll be 75 years old next year. And the reason that we're so committed to public education is because it protects everybody's equality in the American experiment. It teaches our shared secular values, and it treats you the same, or at least it's supposed to, no matter what you believe, no matter what the color of your skin, and no matter what your ability is or disability. And also, again, hearkening back to the racial theme, the majority of Black and brown kids in this country do attend public school. So for equity and equality's sake, we also like to fight for public schools. So we are active both in organizing the faith community, joining with the secular community. We work with a group called Texas Pastors Against Vouchers, places all over the country where we bring the faith and secular communities together to fight vouchers. And then we do the same when we write our friend of the court briefs at the Supreme Court level, like we will be for the Carson versus Macon case that I've told you about, the main case. We get secular and religious groups together to sign on so that we can show the justices that religion does not only, in fact, religious people founded Americans United. Religion doesn't come down just on one side of the religious freedom issue, the side that's trying to turn it into religious privilege.
Do you have any updates for us on where the Do No Harm Act is?
Yeah, we introduced the Do No Harm Act with double the sponsors that we introduced it with in the last Congress. By the end of the last Congress, we had in the House 216 co-sponsors, and you may know that to pass a bill, you only need 218 votes. So we would have had that number of votes had they called for a vote on the floor. In the Senate, we had in the low 30s. And, you know, we've got the capacity for sure to get close to this again. The truth is that right now, this isn't the bill that progressives are moving. Right now, they're moving the Equality Act, which Americans United is coming in and supporting fully, both because we know that religion is often used in public spaces to discriminate against LGBTQ people, and because we are very proud that our advocacy and all of your advocacy has finally brought us to a place where a bill like the Equality Act doesn't run away from religious freedom and church-state separation protections, but rather explicitly says that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act cannot be used to circumvent any of the protections in the bill. So that's just an example of one bill that is moving in our space. You may know that in Washington, it can take decades to pass bills. So don't give up. I think we will get there someday with the Do No Harm Act. We're just not quite ready to have a vote on the bill yet.
What about the Catholic hospitals' rapid expansion into our healthcare system? And what, if anything, can we do about this?
Okay, so that is a real danger to our equality and our freedoms, right? And I absolutely agree. They're sort of complicated legal morass situations. They depend on a lot of factors. And there is a group that I admire greatly called Merger Watch that sort of is right in the center of doing the advocacy there. And Americans United has entered into this fray before. Right now, I would say that our focus is on the discrimination that we see against the LGBTQ community and trying to fight the religion that we see popping up in public schools all across the country. We have a pre-litigation team. It's headed by Ian Smith, and we're able to stop a lot of that discrimination in public schools before it gets to the courts. So that's like another place for our attention right now. And of course, these days, legally, the Supreme Court. So that hasn't been one of the greatest areas, but it is one that we care deeply about, and it is a danger that we need to be looking out for.
I'd just like to comment that Ian Smith is absolutely wonderful. And we have here in California sent him a number of issues that talk about, is this a problem or not? Sometimes I look at something and I know right away whether or not it is. And sometimes it's really hard to tell. And Ian has just done a fabulous job in helping everyone understand.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat box where on our website, you can actually report a violation if you see one. And that's what we exist for. So please don't be shy. Let us know and we'll intervene.
That is great. Finally, I'd like to ask you to comment on ceremonial deism and whether or not there's anything that anyone can do. I know, I'm sorry.
It's a tough, no, I really appreciate the question. We will not have religious freedom until we get rid of ceremonial deism. So I entirely agree that it's a huge problem that we need to take on. And I think right now, the courts aren't the most friendly place for those battles. And we really saw that in the Bladensburg Cross case, the 40-foot towering cement cross in Maryland, in my neck of the woods, where the court found that, in a very strange opinion, that the Latin cross in that context wasn't really a Christian symbol. Are you kidding me? Frankly, a lot of the Christian groups actually had submitted briefs, like our friends, the Baptist Joint Committee, saying that it was sacrilegious for the state to take over a symbol like that and to say that it wasn't religious and that it represented all people, even people who didn't believe that Jesus is their savior. So the courts aren't such a friendly place right now, but I think that sometimes the courts are driving cultural change, and other times cultural change drive the courts. And I think that when we are living and enduring in such an extreme time, and where the Supreme Court is so conservative on our issue, that we could see a genuine backlash, especially given the changing demographics in our country, and a cultural roar about the problem of religion being imposed on all of us in this country. So I would say that there's plenty of space to organize, to make noise, to write letters and op-eds, and to make our voices known. And I'll just say also, I was reviewing just before I spoke with you all, I had the honor of keynoting the Freedom from Religion Foundation annual conference back when we could do those in person. And when I first started at Americans United, and I wrote about 3 lessons that I learned from working on LGBTQ equality that I thought could transfer into the non-religious advocacy community. And what I said was, number 1, sort of the coming out, because I think this is linked to the ceremonial deism and the cultural change that we need. Even though I know it's not even safe in many parts of this country to come out as an atheist or even as non-religious, I think coming out is really important because everyone's got non-religious people in their family. So I think that's important. And, you know, everyone loves a non-religious person and probably an atheist. So that's number 1, right? If everyone would be brave enough to say so. Number 2, as another parallel to the marriage equality movement, is we went for the jugular in that movement, meaning that opposite sex married people, one of which I am actually, claim so broadly that they have a monopoly on love, right? And that's the way marriage is sort of, that's the better version of love. And so it was really important to show same-sex couples that were in love, you know, and to show that their love was just the same as opposite sex married people's love, no difference. And so I think the equivalent to that in the non-religious community is morality. Religious people claim that they are morally superior, but non-religious people that I know have the moral scruples that are incredible. Now, let's not get carried away. I just want to say it's no good for advocacy in this country to say that non-religious people have better moral scruples, right? So hold back on that. Just like there were plenty of parts of the marriage equality movement that wanted to say that same-sex couples had better, more equal love and relationships. And for advocacy's sake, it was like, quiet that down a little bit in the broader context. And so, how can we really make clear that non-religious people, right, in movies, in TV shows, just in general, have the morality that religious people have? And third and finally, it was really important in the marriage equality movement to get opposite sex married people to be advocates. They weren't the only ones, but it was really important. It's really important for religious freedom, which will never be achieved until the non-religious have full equality and respect in our society, to get the religious people on board for the rights of the non-religious. So I think one of the best things that you can do ultimately to fight ceremonial deism, which is imposed because of ignorance and in part, and also because of favoritism and privilege, is to get allies in the faith community, and to get allies on religious freedom and church-state separation. So I'll stop there, and it's just been an honor to spend part of my Saturday with you all, and I appreciate all the advocacy that you all do very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel.